profoundly poignant moment for me in my life. Standing in the midst of this historic congregation, which began within 10 years of the Civil War, when the streets of Washington were more filled with mud than marble. It pleases me greatly to stand in the midst of this historic congregation that is yet history making. It pleases me greatly because the God that you serve is the God that I serve. I'm reminded of a very modest story about a modest kid from South Carolina. I was born in El Paso, Texas. My father was an Army officer. I was born at General William Beaumont Hospital at Fort Bliss. And on the day I was born at 3 pounds and 3 ounces, the doctor rushed to the side of my mother and told her, "Your son is not likely to live beyond the end of the day." My mother reached out to my grandmother, a staunch African Methodist Episcopal member. My grandmother got down on her knees and she prayed for me. But the doctor also said to my mother, "If you are religious, you need to reach out to a chaplain and have somebody pray for your boy." And so they looked high and low for a Catholic chaplain, not to be found. They looked high and low for a Protestant chaplain, not to be found. But they found a rabbi who prayed for a little boy from Georgetown, South Carolina. And between the rabbi's prayers and the prayers of my African Methodist Episcopal grandmother, I am here today worshiping with people who yet serve my God. I'm deeply grateful to the rabbi for extending to me this wonderful honor, and to Attorney Jonathan Greenblatt for opening this wonderful congregation to me. I also extend a word of appreciation to my church family, Turner Memorial African Methodist Episcopal Church, who've been with me over the years. In fact, I can recall as a young preacher kneeling down at the altar during communion, concluding the service, making my way back to the pastor's study, and having the pastor give to me an envelope with money in it. And the pastor said to me, he said, "Brother Brooks, what's the state of your shoes?" I said, "I'm not sure what you mean." He said, "Brother, cross your legs and look at the bottom of your shoes." I crossed my legs, looked at the bottom of my shoes, and realized there was not much shoe left. problem. Somebody in the congregation saw the state of your shoes and the state of your finances, and they want you to go out and buy a new pair of shoes. I've traveled a little way since then, but I've never forgotten how much you mean to me and how much you've been with me on my journey. Thank you so much. And to my wonderful wife, Janice, who has loved me when I've been less than lovable, and been with me when I told her, look, I'm going to be a civil rights lawyer, probably not going to earn a lot of money, and you should know my cat and I exist on the same diet. We both eat Chinese food. And she's nevertheless remained with me. Amidst this congregation, this august body, I'm reminded of a true and humorous story. I'm reminded that when I started my ministry many years ago, I found myself in London, England on a Sunday morning. And standing outside of this beautiful Gothic cathedral with spires soaring up toward the heavens, stained glass windows reflecting the multicolored, multi-hued, iridescent beauty of God. And as a young, naive, presumptuous preacher, I assumed standing outside of this beautiful Gothic cathedral that there were about 2,000 or so people inside waiting to hear this young, presumptuous preacher preach. Well, I made my way into the pulpit and I immediately noticed the obvious. The pastor and exactly 2 members. True story. One member I'll call Miss Jones and another member I'll call Miss Smith. But I did then as I endeavor to do now, and I've endeavored to do across the length of my years of ministry, which is to say that you speak, you preach with sincerity, with conviction from the heart. And so as I was preaching, I immediately noticed the obvious, that Miss Jones immediately fell asleep. True story. But as I was preaching and speaking from the heart, I immediately noticed the obvious that Miss Smith seemed to hang on to every word I had to say. And in my theological and ecclesial tradition, she said amen at all the right moments. She said hallelujah at all the right times. She lifted her hands, she tapped her feet, and I thought to myself, at least I'm reaching one somebody this Sunday morning. True story. After I concluded my little homily, I made my way over to the pastor, and the pastor said to me, Brother Brooks, you know, I'm so sorry. Miss Jones, she falls asleep on everybody. And Miss Smith, she's out of her mind and did not understand a thing you had to say. True story. And so, it pleases me greatly, Rabbi, to be in this august body, with people who are wide awake and presumably in their right mind. During this sacred service, we find ourselves between the dusk of Dr. King's birthday and the dawn of a national holiday. We find ourselves situated between progress and peril. We find ourselves at the crossroads of tumultuous, morally challenging, and ethically vexing times. We find ourselves this evening in the midst of this service, morally confused and ethically befuddled by these times. We find ourselves at a moment in our history that the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin might describe as no ordinary time. We find ourselves at this moment, in this hour, in this very minute, ourselves as older people looking at our younger brothers and sisters, finding it difficult to answer their moral and ethical questions. When my oldest son, when he was small, he came home from school one day and posed a question that strained the boundaries of his moral imagination and the capacity of his vocabulary. He said to me, "Daddy, why are people racist against gay people?" A little older and a more mature sense of moral cognition, in recent days he posed the question to me, "Why do people hate Jews?" I was as tongue-tied then as I was when he was 8 years old. Vexing times. And yet in the midst of this time, there is a towering prophetic figure who looms large over our moral landscape by the name of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. How might we describe him? Can he be described as a hostage of history, relegated to the golden, gilded pages of history, never to speak to this moment, never to speak to this time, never to speak to our young people, never to inform and enlighten and illuminate who we are, what we stand for, and what we stand against, and what we're willing to stand up for our God? Is he a hostage of history? Is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King a caricature, colorless and characterless, upon which and through whom we can impose whatever values we happen to believe in, we happen to choose, sell any product that strikes our fancy and that will elicit a profit? In recent days, there's been a commercial airing in the state of California that begins with the tragic fact that African Americans are unemployed at astronomical rates. And then the narrator of the commercial proceeds to go from the social scientific in terms of these statistics that speak to the unemployment rate of African Americans, to move from that premise to the conclusion that immigration is at fault and that Dr. King would sanction the message. For our prophets, I'd like to suggest to you this evening, in the midst of people who stand within a prophetic tradition, that Dr. King is not a prop, not a hostage of history, not a caricature that is colorless and characterless, but rather he is a prophet for this present age. Those of you who hail from the African Methodist Episcopal tradition may recall a hymn that yet goes this way: to serve the present age, my calling to fulfill, may all my powers engage to do my master's will. There's a bit of verse that speaks to this present prophet found in the book of Isaiah that will sound familiar to anyone and everyone who's ever felt the call of God on their lives. The prophet Isaiah, his voice yet resounds and reverberates down the corridors of history into our hearts at this very moment. The words are these: the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good tidings to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and the opening of the prison to those who are bound. A prophet for the present era. Dr. King as a plastic saint, if we see Dr. King as an unattainable, a collection of unattainable virtues and characteristics, he can't speak to us. He can't inspire us. He can't encourage us. He can't lift us up through the eloquence of his example. To my youngest brothers and sisters here who are in grade school, I say to you in 3rd grade and 4th grade, remember the Dr. King who was an okay high school student, a pretty good college student. But when he reached seminary and found a love for the study of God's Word and His Scripture, the lowest grade he got on an all-A transcript was a C in public speaking. There's a hope for the rest of us. To those of you who've ever grappled and wrestled with doubt, look at the Dr. King who inspired millions with his faith, yet wrestled with the very profundity of doubt and anxiety and fear and trepidation in the midnight hour. Recall the Dr. King who stood on a balcony looking out over the Gulf of Mexico in the midnight hour. And his friend, the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, worried about his friend Dr. King, worried that he might be suicidal, found him looking out over this beautiful body of work. He asked Dr. King, "Why are you up at the midnight hour?" And Dr. King simply pointed out to the water. He lifted up these words: "Rock of ages, cleft for me, oh, let me hide myself in thee." In other words, our God will sustain you. Our God will stand behind you. Our God will lift you up. Our God is in our midst, and we need not fear. We can emulate a man like that, because a man like that is, in fact, a man filled with the flaws and the foibles and the frailties of all men and all women. We can be inspired by a man like that. A prophet for the present age. Consider 4 challenges for our time. The challenge of racism and anti-Semitism, which I might describe as the misbegotten offspring of fear and hate. Consider, in Ferguson, Missouri, we have young people who have seen their schoolmate, their classmate, their colleague, a young man like themselves, struck down in the prime of his life because he was initially suspected of jaywalking. And these young people have lifted up the words, "Black Lives Matter." Move from Ferguson to France, to a kosher grocery. And when you have Jews assassinated, killed as a consequence of their creed, their religion, their ethnicity, their personhood and dignity as children of God, I say Black Lives Matter, but we need to hang signs over Safeway and Harris Teeter and A&P and every grocery store in the metropolitan area that say Jewish lives matter. Because all lives matter. Every child of God matters. Abraham Heschel, taught us that the journey to the sacred takes us through the sacred. To reach the sacred space within the hearts of Baptists and Methodists, Catholics and Protestants, Jews and Gentiles, men and women, gay and straight, we have to go through the cycle. It's not enough for us to stand and pray and praise within our churches, our temples, our mosques, and our synagogues. We have to enter a secular space and declare in the midst of the religious extremists that Jewish lives matter, black lives matter, Muslim lives matter, our lives matter. They cannot be sacrificed on the altar of religious bigotry. The fact that we have to lift up that which should be morally axiomatic in 2014 is a shame before our God, but yet we must. When we think about a generation of young people who are racially profiled, when African American men, nearly a fourth, report being mistreated or profiled at the hands of the police in any given month. When a black young man is 25 more times likely to lose his life at the hands of a police officer than his white brother. When 1 out of every 3 young people will be arrested by the age of 23. When we have 2.3 million people behind bars, 65 million Americans with criminal records, and 1 out of every 4 adults with a criminal record, it says to me that we have made an unrelenting or seemingly unrelenting commitment to incarcerate, and we have undercommitted ourselves to educate. And when we read the eloquence of the letter from the Birmingham City Jail, can we not ask ourselves, how does that letter read to the millions of black and brown people behind bars? How does that letter read to the hundreds of thousands of young people in our jails, in our prisons, and in our juvenile lockup? How does that letter read to a generation of young people who are profiled and stigmatized, degraded and dehumanized? How does that letter read? I want to suggest to you that Dr. King is not a captive of history. He speaks to us through the eloquence of his example that we have to turn around this prison industrial complex by shutting it down. Those of you who believe Dr. King does not have something to say about this challenge, I ask you to consider this. Only a few years ago, 2 sepia-toned photographs, 2 black and white portraits of yesteryear, were unearthed in the bottom of a file cabinet in Montgomery, Alabama. One photograph depicted a young man possessing a ministerial bearing, an extraordinary sense of gravitas. Yet beneath his distinguished face were the numbers 7089. The second photograph depicted a beautiful older woman whose dignity was scarred by these dehumanizing numbers, 7 7053. The world does not know the young man by the number 7089. We know him by the name the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We don't know the older woman by the number 7053. We know her by the name, school children know her the world over, by the name Mrs. Rosa Louise Parks. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks had criminal records, but those criminal records did not summarize, did not sum up the sum total of their dignity and their God-given value. It's a Martin Luther King, by his example, by his work, yet speaks to the importance of decriminalizing a generation of our young people. In recent days, many have seen the film Selma. And as you recall, the Selma to Montgomery March began with a few hundred, ended with tens of thousands, with only 50 people making that 50-mile march over the course of 3 weeks. And that march was done in order to secure the right to vote. Here we are on the 50th anniversary of Selma, the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, in the wake of a Supreme Court decision which has gutted the Voting Rights Act and has left our nation, our democracy, this constitutional democracy, unprotected. And we see from coast to coast state legislatures engaged in a Machiavellian frenzy of disenfranchisement. How is it that in the state of Texas, the ID that you use to carry a gun is sufficient proof of citizenship to vote? But the ID that one uses to carry a book of Shakespeare or chemistry or physics or philosophy is deemed civically insufficient to vote. And lest this point be insufficiently clear, let us turn to the state of Georgia where my mother resides. When she was a young woman, a teenager, she marched for voting rights, marched for civil rights, when she was well able to walk. Now that she is in her 70s, she called up her son, who's supposed to be a civil rights lawyer, as she is hobbling around her apartment with her walker because she's stricken with multiple sclerosis. And she asked me, she said, "Son, I'm looking for my passport, I'm looking for my driver's license, I'm looking for sufficient forms of ID because I want to make sure I can vote." This disenfranchisement. Is it a matter of race? Is it a matter of disability? Is it a matter of age? Or is it a matter of our constitutional character as a nation? When we consider Dr. Martin Luther King, who was beaten, who was bloodied, who was stigmatized and humiliated as a consequence of his vigilance and his valor in terms of vindicating the constitutional values of our country and standing up for the right to vote, I say, when we look at him then, consider what he did then, we yet say, in the firmament of our freedoms, in the constellation of our constitutional rights, the right to vote shines as the North Star. We will not allow that light to go out. We will not allow that light to dim. We will not allow that light to go out. We will not give up. Considering the words and work, life, and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, we have to consider the state of our economy and the state of our morality. when we find ourselves as a nation, a beacon unto the world, on the backside of an uneven, uncertain economic recovery, in the midst of a rising tide of income inequality that threatens to drown seniors who must choose, who must make a Faustian choice between prescription pills and bread for the week. College graduates who have left home only to move back home, back into their old bedrooms because they can't find a job. An economy in which we find people who have full-time aspirations, full-time ambitions, full-time commitment, full-time work ethic, but who can only find part-time work. And when we think about Dr. Martin Luther King's last campaign, the Poor People's Movement and March, when we think about a tent city erected in Washington after his death, inundated by rain, inundated by bad weather, inundated by difficult logistics. But that's what he left behind, a commitment to economic justice. When we think about Dr. Martin Luther King in Memphis, standing alongside men holding large signs. The signs did not declare, "I am a member of the middle class." The signs did not declare, "I am the 1%. Those signs did not declare, "I am the 99%. Those signs simply declared, "I am a man, I am a child of God, I belong to somebody." As we consider what fiscal policies, what employment policies, what workforce development policies to enact to ensure that people can work, let us think about these moral propositions. Jobs are not merely about dollars, but dignity. Employment is not merely about net worth, it's about self-worth. There's something about somebody earning a living, protecting and preserving and providing for their family that speaks to who they are and what they're capable of. When we think about Dr. King on this holiday, let us not celebrate the holiday. Let us consecrate ourselves with service on that day. On this holiday, when we see anti-Semitism raging in Europe, out front and obvious, and raging in this country, subtly, not so obvious, but just as painful. When we think about racism raging in this country, distorting, marring, corrupting the character of our children, let us say to ourselves, we can get transformed, racial and ethnic battlegrounds into a pristine playground where all of God's children can laugh, play, and sing, red, yellow, black, brown, or white. We're all precious in God's sight. And when we consider this prophet, this present age, we consider his courage, and we are inspired to be courageous ourselves. We consider his sacrifice, and we are inspired to sacrifice ourselves. Let us also be inspired by his faith in us. On the night before he was assassinated, he stood in a church in Memphis, Tennessee, with foreboding lightning outside and ominous rain coming down. He yet declared in the midst of God's house, I may not get to the promised land with you, but I promise that you as a people will get to the promised land. He had faith in us, faith in future generations, faith in our children. We can but believe in the God he believed in. lift up with new meaning the words the choir invoked so powerfully only moments ago. Lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun.